Baby found mother bear. Teaching cubs. First aid on human dummies. What happened next was shocking. The morning mist clung to the forest floor like a whispered secret, and Ethan Marshall found himself walking deeper into the woods than he had ever ventured before. His camera bag bounced gently against his hip with each careful step, the familiar weight bringing him comfort in this unfamiliar territory. He had been a wildlife photographer for nearly 15 years, but lately, something felt different about his work. The usual spots near the main trails had become too predictable, too crowded with other photographers and hikers. He craved something authentic, something untouched by human interference. The scent of pine needles and damp earth filled his nostrils as he pushed through a cluster of low-hanging branches, their moisture droplets catching the early sunlight like tiny diamonds. Ethan paused to adjust his camera settings, listening to the forest around him. The sounds here were different from the edges of civilization. No distant hum of traffic, no voices carrying through the trees. Just the soft whisper of wind through leaves, the occasional crack of a branch settling, and somewhere far off, the gentle trickle of water over stones. He had always found peace in these quiet moments, but today felt special somehow. His boots made soft impressions in the moss-covered ground as he continued forward, following what might have once been a deer path but was now barely visible through years of neglect. The trees grew older and taller the deeper he went, their massive trunks telling stories of decades, perhaps centuries, of growth. Some were so wide that Ethan could have wrapped his arms around them 3 times and still not reached all the way around. Shafts of golden sunlight filtered through the canopy above, creating a natural cathedral that made him want to whisper rather than speak aloud. He found himself moving more slowly, not from fatigue, but from a growing sense that he was entering something sacred, something that demanded respect and patience. As he rounded a particularly large oak tree, Ethan stopped short. Before him stretched a circular clearing, perhaps 50 feet across, that seemed to have been carved out of the forest by nature itself. The grass here was shorter and softer, almost like a natural carpet, and wildflowers dotted the space in gentle clusters of purple and yellow. But what caught his attention immediately were the objects scattered throughout the clearing. At first glance, they looked like fallen logs or large rocks, but as his eyes adjusted to the different lighting, he realized they were something else entirely. Mannequins. Old, weathered training dummies that looked like they belonged in a medical school or emergency training facility. There were 6 of them, positioned at various points around the clearing, some lying flat, others propped against small mounds of earth. Their plastic skin had been dulled by years of weather, and moss had begun to grow in patches across their surfaces. Ethan blinked several times, certain he must be seeing things incorrectly. What were medical training dummies doing in the middle of an untouched forest, miles from any road or building? He approached one of the dummies cautiously, his photographer's eye automatically noting the way the morning light played across its surface. The dummy was positioned as if it were injured, one arm bent at an awkward angle, the other stretched out as if reaching for help. Around its torso, someone had carefully arranged what looked like bandages made from strips of bark and moss. The craftsmanship was crude but deliberate, as if someone had been practicing medical techniques using natural materials found in the forest. Ethan raised his camera and took several shots, the quiet click of the shutter seeming unnaturally loud in the peaceful clearing. Through his lens, he could see more details. Each dummy had been arranged differently, some with what appeared to be splints made from small branches, others with poultices of mud and leaves applied to various parts of their bodies. It was like stumbling upon an outdoor medical training ground, but one that had been abandoned to nature for years. The mystery deepened as he moved from dummy to dummy, documenting each one. Who had brought these here? Why had they been left in such a remote location? And most puzzling of all, why did it look like someone had been maintaining them? The moss bandages looked relatively fresh, and the positioning of the dummies seemed too deliberate to be the result of random weathering or animal interference. As Ethan knelt beside one of the dummies to get a close-up shot of what appeared to be a carefully constructed neck brace made from woven grass, he heard something that made his blood freeze. A low, rumbling sound that seemed to come from the trees at the edge of the clearing. He slowly lowered his camera and turned his head toward the sound, his heart beginning to beat faster. There, at the tree line, perhaps 30 feet away, stood a massive brown bear. Ethan's first instinct was to run, but years of wildlife photography had taught him that sudden movements were often more dangerous than staying still. The bear was enormous, easily 7 feet tall when standing on her hind legs, with thick, chocolate-colored fur that seemed to absorb the dappled sunlight. But what struck Ethan most was her posture. She wasn't aggressive or threatening. Instead, she seemed to be watching him with what could only be described as curiosity. Behind the mother bear, two smaller shapes emerged from the undergrowth. Cubs, probably born earlier that spring, their fur still fluffy, and their movements playful and uncoordinated. They tumbled over each other as they followed their mother, occasionally stopping to investigate interesting smells or sounds. Ethan remained perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe as the bear family moved into the clearing. What happened next would stay with Ethan for the rest of his life. Instead of investigating the strange human who had invaded their space, the mother bear walked directly to one of the mannequins. She sniffed at it carefully, then used her massive paw to gently adjust its position. The cubs watched intently as their mother demonstrated something that seemed impossible. She carefully picked up a piece of moss in her mouth and placed it on what would have been a wound on the dummy's arm, then used her nose to press it into place. Ethan's hand shook as he slowly raised his camera. Through the viewfinder, he watched the most extraordinary scene he had ever witnessed. The mother bear was teaching her cubs what appeared to be first aid techniques, using the weathered mannequins as patients. One cub tried to copy its mother's actions, clumsily picking up a small stick and attempting to position it like a splint against the dummy's leg. When the stick fell, the mother bear gently nudged it back into place, making a soft, chuffing sound that seemed encouraging. The second cub was more interested in playing, rolling around near one of the dummies and batting at the moss bandages. But when its mother made a different sound, lower and more authoritative, the cub immediately stopped playing and watched as she demonstrated how to use leaves to cover what appeared to be a chest wound on another dummy. The precision of her movements was breathtaking. She wasn't randomly placing natural materials on the mannequins. She was following some kind of systematic approach, as if she had been trained in emergency medical procedures. Ethan's camera captured frame after frame of this impossible scene. The mother bear moved from dummy to dummy, showing her cubs different techniques. At one mannequin, she demonstrated how to create a tourniquet using twisted grass. At another, she showed them how to position the dummy's head to keep airways clear. The cubs followed along, their attempts clumsy, but clearly trying to imitate their mother's precise movements. The most remarkable moment came when one of the cubs appeared to make a mistake, placing a mud poultice in the wrong location on a dummy. Instead of correcting it harshly, the mother bear gently moved the cub aside and repositioned the natural bandage correctly. Then she nuzzled the cub affectionately, as if praising it for trying. The tender interaction between mother and child, combined with the surreal nature of the lesson being taught, brought tears to Ethan's eyes. For nearly an hour, Ethan watched and photographed as the bear family continued their training session. The mother bear's patience seemed endless as she repeated demonstrations, corrected mistakes, and encouraged her cubs to try again when they struggled with a particular technique. It was like watching a master teacher working with eager but inexperienced students, except the teacher was a wild animal and the subject matter was emergency medicine. As the sun climbed higher and the morning mist began to dissipate, the mother bear seemed to sense that the lesson was complete. She made a series of soft grunts to her cubs, who immediately stopped what they were doing and gathered around her. For a moment, all three bears looked directly at Ethan, and he felt a chill run down his spine. But instead of aggression, he sensed something else in their gaze. Acknowledgement, perhaps, or even a kind of ancient wisdom that seemed to recognize his presence as non-threatening. The bear family moved back toward the tree line with the same quiet dignity they had shown throughout the entire encounter. The mother bear paused at the edge of the clearing and looked back once, her dark eyes meeting Ethan's through his camera lens. In that moment, he felt a connection to something far older and more mysterious than anything he had ever experienced. Then, as silently as they had appeared, the bears disappeared into the forest, leaving only the sound of rustling leaves and Ethan's racing heartbeat. Ethan remained motionless for several more minutes, partly from caution and partly from shock at what he had just witnessed. When he was certain the bears were gone, he slowly stood and walked around the clearing again, this time seeing everything with new eyes. The mannequins weren't just randomly placed training dummies. They were part of some kind of ongoing educational program, one that had been passed down from mother to cubs in ways that defied everything he thought he knew about animal behavior. He spent the rest of the morning documenting every detail of the clearing, taking photographs from multiple angles and making notes about the positioning of each dummy and the natural materials that had been used to simulate medical treatments. The more he studied the scene, the more questions arose. How long had this been going on? How had the bears learned these techniques? And most importantly, what did it mean? As Ethan finally began the long hike back to his truck, his mind raced with possibilities. He had captured something extraordinary on camera, something that would challenge everything scientists thought they knew about animal intelligence and learning. But more than that, he had witnessed something beautiful and profound, a demonstration of care and teaching that transcended species boundaries. The walk back through the forest felt different now. Every sound seemed more significant, every shadow potentially hiding more mysteries. Ethan found himself looking at the trees and undergrowth with new appreciation, wondering what other secrets the wilderness might be keeping. The weight of his camera bag felt heavier now, not from the equipment inside, but from the responsibility of the images he carried. When he reached his truck and began the drive back to town, Ethan couldn't stop thinking about what he had seen. The bear's behavior had been so deliberate, so purposeful, that it suggested a level of intelligence and cultural transmission that most people would find hard to believe. He knew that when he shared these photographs and told this story, many would assume he had somehow staged the encounter or misinterpreted what he was seeing. But Ethan knew what he had witnessed was real, and more importantly, it was significant. As he drove through the small mountain town where he had been staying, he noticed things he hadn't paid attention to before. The local library, the historical society, the old-timers sitting outside the general store who might have stories about the forest and its inhabitants. If he was going to understand what he had seen, he would need to dig deeper into the history of this place. That evening, in his small cabin rental, Ethan uploaded the photographs to his computer and began the careful process of reviewing each image. What he saw on his screen confirmed everything he remembered and more. The clarity of the bear's actions was undeniable. The mother bear's techniques were systematic and consistent. The cub's attempts to learn and improve were clearly documented. And, in several frames, he could see details that had escaped his notice during the actual encounter. In one photograph, he noticed that the mother bear had arranged small stones around one of the mannequins in a very specific pattern. In another, he could see that she had used different types of moss for different simulated injuries, suggesting she understood that different treatments were appropriate for different conditions. The level of sophistication in her teaching methods was staggering. As Ethan worked late into the night, enhancing and organizing his photographs, he felt a growing sense of responsibility. He had been given a glimpse into something extraordinary, something that could change how humans understood their relationship with the natural world. But he also felt protective of what he had seen. The bears had allowed him to witness their private lesson, and he didn't want to exploit that trust or put them in danger by attracting too much attention to their remote clearing. The more he thought about it, the more Ethan realized that sharing this discovery responsibly would require more than just posting photographs online or selling them to a nature magazine. He needed to understand the context, the history, and the implications of what he had witnessed, and that meant he would have to return to the forest, not just once, but as many times as necessary to piece together the full story. As he finally prepared for bed, Ethan looked out the window of his cabin at the dark silhouette of the forest in the distance. Somewhere out there, in a hidden clearing, weathered mannequins waited for their next lesson. Somewhere in those ancient trees, a mother bear was settling down for the night with her cubs, perhaps dreaming of the day's teaching or planning tomorrow's curriculum. The thought that kept Ethan awake was both thrilling and humbling. He had stumbled upon something that challenged every assumption about the boundaries between human knowledge and animal instinct. But more than that, he had witnessed an act of love, a mother passing on precious knowledge to her children in the hope that it might someday save a life. The fact that the knowledge was medical in nature, focused on healing and helping, made it even more profound. If people could see what he had seen, if they could understand the depth of intelligence and compassion displayed by these wild animals, maybe it would change how they thought about conservation, about coexistence, about the value of preserving wild spaces. Maybe his photographs could be more than just documentation of an unusual encounter. Maybe they could be a bridge between two worlds, a way of showing that the line between civilization and wilderness was far more blurred than most people realized. As sleep finally began to claim him, Ethan made a decision. He would return to the clearing as soon as possible, not as a casual observer, but as a student. He would learn everything he could about this phenomenon, and when he finally shared it with the world, he would do so in a way that honored both the bears who had trusted him with their secret and the broader implications of what their behavior might mean for understanding animal intelligence and the interconnectedness of all life. The last thing he remembered before falling asleep was the image of the mother bear's eyes as she looked at him across the clearing, dark and knowing, as if she understood exactly what he was thinking and had decided, for reasons of her own, to let him stay and watch. Tomorrow, he would begin the real work of understanding what he had witnessed. Tonight, he would dream of bears and mannequins, of ancient wisdom passed down through generations, and of secrets hidden in clearings where few humans ever ventured. Chapter 2. The Ritual of the Berries. The pre-dawn darkness felt different as Ethan made his way back through the forest 3 days later. His boots followed the same path he had memorized from his first visit, but now every step carried the weight of anticipation and purpose. He had spent the intervening days researching everything he could find about bear behavior, animal intelligence, and the history of the region, but nothing had prepared him for what he hoped to witness again. The forest seemed to welcome him back, the familiar sense of pine and earth greeting him like old friends as he navigated through the maze of ancient trees. This time, Ethan arrived at the clearing well before sunrise, positioning himself behind the same large oak tree that had concealed him during his first encounter. He had brought additional equipment today, including a telephoto lens that would allow him to capture even finer details without disturbing the bears, and a small notebook where he planned to document everything he observed. The clearing lay before him in the pale light of early morning, the 6 mannequins positioned exactly as he remembered them, their weathered surfaces gleaming with dew. As the sun began to paint the sky in soft shades of pink and gold, Ethan heard the familiar sound of rustling leaves that announced the bear's arrival. His heart rate quickened as the mother bear emerged from the tree line, followed closely by her 2 cubs. But today, something was different about their approach. The mother bear carried something in her mouth, a small bundle that she set down carefully near the center of the clearing before beginning her inspection of the mannequins. Through his telephoto lens, Ethan could see that the bundle contained berries, deep purple fruits that looked like wild blackberries but seemed somehow different in their intensity of color. The mother bear nudged the bundle open with her nose, revealing perhaps 24 of the dark berries, each one perfectly ripe and glistening in the morning light. She made a soft chuffing sound to her cubs, who immediately gathered around the berries with obvious interest. What happened next challenged everything Ethan thought he understood about the bear's training routine. Instead of immediately beginning the medical demonstrations he had witnessed before, the mother bear carefully selected one berry and carried it to the nearest mannequin. Using her teeth with incredible precision, she punctured the berry and allowed its dark juice to drip onto specific areas of the dummy's plastic skin. The juice left vivid red stains that looked remarkably like blood, creating the appearance of fresh wounds on the otherwise unmarked surface. Ethan's camera clicked quietly as he documented this new phase of the bear's ritual. The mother bear moved methodically from mannequin to mannequin, using the berry juice to create what appeared to be different types of injuries on each dummy. On one, she created the simulation of a head wound, the dark juice trickling down from the crown of the plastic skull. On another, she carefully applied the berry stain to create the appearance of a deep gash across the dummy's chest. Each application was deliberate and specific, as if she were following a curriculum that required different medical scenarios for her cubs to practice. The cubs watched intently as their mother worked, occasionally trying to help by bringing her additional berries from the central pile. When one cub attempted to apply berry juice to a mannequin on its own, the mother bear gently corrected its technique, showing it how to control the flow of juice to create realistic-looking wounds rather than random stains. The patience she displayed was remarkable, never showing frustration when her cubs made mistakes, always ready to demonstrate the correct method as many times as necessary. Once all the mannequins had been prepared with their simulated injuries, the mother bear began the second phase of the morning's lesson. She moved to the first dummy, the one with the simulated head wound, and began demonstrating how to treat the injury using natural materials from the forest floor. But her techniques today were more sophisticated than what Ethan had observed during his first visit. She showed her cubs how to clean the wound area first, using soft moss dampened with morning dew, before applying a poultice made from specific plants she had apparently gathered before arriving at the clearing. The cubs followed their mother's lead, each working on a different mannequin under her watchful supervision. Ethan noticed that they were becoming more skilled with each lesson, their movements more confident, and their understanding of the procedures more complete. The smaller of the 2 cubs, who had struggled with the splinting technique during the previous session, now handled the task with considerably more competence, carefully positioning small branches against the dummy's simulated broken arm and securing them with twisted grass. As the morning progressed, Ethan began to notice patterns in the bear's behavior that suggested an even deeper level of organization than he had initially realized. The mother bear didn't just teach random medical techniques. She seemed to follow a specific sequence, starting with assessment of the simulated injuries, then moving through cleaning, treatment, and stabilization procedures. She even demonstrated what appeared to be patient monitoring, returning periodically to check on previously treated mannequins and adjusting their natural bandages as needed. The most remarkable moment came when the larger cub encountered a problem it couldn't solve on its own. The mannequin it was working on had been prepared with multiple simulated injuries, and the cub seemed overwhelmed by the complexity of treating them all. Instead of struggling alone or giving up, the cub made a specific vocalization that immediately brought its mother to its side. Together, they worked through a triage process, with the mother bear showing her cub how to prioritize the most serious injuries and treat them in order of importance. Ethan found himself completely absorbed in documenting this extraordinary educational process. Through his camera lens, he captured images of intergenerational knowledge transfer that challenged every assumption about the limitations of animal intelligence. The bears weren't just following instinct or engaging in random play. They were participating in a sophisticated training program that required abstract thinking, problem-solving skills, and the ability to apply learned concepts to new situations. The session continued for nearly 2 hours, with the mother bear introducing increasingly complex scenarios for her cubs to navigate. She showed them how to work together when treating a single patient, with one cub stabilizing the mannequin while the other applied treatment. She demonstrated how to adapt their techniques when certain materials weren't available, substituting different types of moss or leaves when their preferred options were scarce. Most impressively, she taught them what appeared to be basic diagnostic skills, showing them how to assess the severity of different types of simulated injuries before beginning treatment. As the sun climbed higher and the morning began to warm, the bear's training session gradually wound down. The mother bear made a thorough inspection of each mannequin, checking her cub's work and making minor adjustments where necessary. But instead of simply correcting mistakes, she seemed to be providing feedback, using different vocalizations and physical gestures to indicate approval or suggest improvements. The cubs responded to her guidance with obvious eagerness to please, making additional adjustments to their work until they received what appeared to be her approval. The final phase of the morning's ritual was perhaps the most touching. The mother bear gathered her cubs around the central pile of remaining berries and shared them as a kind of reward for their hard work. But even this seemingly simple act had educational value. She demonstrated which berries were safe to eat and which should be saved for their medical applications, teaching her cubs to distinguish between different varieties by scent and appearance. As the bear family prepared to leave the clearing, Ethan noticed something that hadn't been apparent during his first visit. The mother bear made one final circuit of the mannequins, but this time she wasn't checking her cub's work or making adjustments to the natural bandages. Instead, she seemed to be paying her respects, touching each dummy gently with her nose, in what could only be described as a gesture of gratitude or acknowledgement. The cubs followed their mother's example, each one approaching the mannequins they had worked on and touching them in the same gentle manner. It was as if they understood that these weathered training aids were more than just objects for practice. They were partners in their education, deserving of respect and care. The solemnity of this final ritual sent chills down Ethan's spine as he realized he was witnessing something far more profound than a simple training exercise. As the bears disappeared back into the forest, Ethan remained hidden behind his oak tree for several more minutes, processing what he had just observed. The sophistication of the bear's behavior had exceeded even his elevated expectations from the first encounter. The systematic use of berry juice to create realistic wound simulations, the progressive complexity of the training scenarios, the collaborative problem-solving between mother and cubs, and the respectful conclusion to the session all pointed to a level of cultural development that most scientists would consider impossible in wild animals. When he finally emerged from his hiding spot and approached the mannequins for a closer inspection, Ethan was amazed by the quality of the bear's work. The natural bandages were applied with precision that would have impressed human medical students. The splints were properly aligned and securely fastened. Even the positioning of the mannequins had been adjusted to optimize treatment access, showing an understanding of patient care that went far beyond basic first aid techniques. Ethan spent the rest of the morning documenting the aftermath of the bear's training session, photographing each mannequin in detail and taking notes about the specific treatments that had been applied. He also collected samples of the berries that had been used to create the wound simulations, carefully placing them in specimen containers for later identification. The more he studied the scene, the more questions arose about how this remarkable behavior had developed and been transmitted through generations of bears. As he prepared to leave the clearing, Ethan made a decision that would shape the rest of his investigation. He would return every few days to observe and document the bears' training sessions, building a comprehensive record of their techniques and behaviors. But he would also begin researching the human history of this area, looking for clues about how these medical training methods might have originated and been passed on to the bear population. The hike back to his truck felt shorter today, perhaps because Ethan's mind was so occupied with processing what he had witnessed. The bear's behavior suggested not just intelligence, but wisdom, a deep understanding of healing and care that transcended species boundaries. The fact that they had developed their own methods for creating realistic training scenarios and had established respectful protocols for their educational activities indicated a level of cultural sophistication that challenged fundamental assumptions about animal consciousness and capability. That afternoon, Ethan drove into the nearest town with a new sense of purpose. He needed to find someone who knew the local history, someone who might be able to provide context for the extraordinary behavior he had documented. The town was small and quiet, the kind of place where longtime residents would remember stories passed down through generations. If there were answers to be found about the origins of the bear's medical training, they would most likely be found in the memories of people who had lived in the shadow of the forest for decades. As he walked down the main street, looking for the local historical society or library, Ethan reflected on how his understanding of the situation had evolved since his first encounter with the bears. What had initially seemed like an impossible anomaly now felt like the tip of an iceberg, the visible portion of a much larger and more complex story. The bears weren't just mimicking human medical procedures. They had developed their own sophisticated training protocols, complete with realistic simulations, progressive skill development, and respectful rituals that honored their learning process. The implications were staggering. If bears could develop and maintain such complex cultural practices, what did that say about animal intelligence in general? How many other species might possess capabilities that humans had never recognized or acknowledged? And most importantly, what responsibilities did this knowledge create for those who were privileged to witness and document such extraordinary behavior? As Ethan approached the town library, he felt the weight of these questions settling on his shoulders. He had stumbled upon something that could revolutionize understanding of animal cognition and behavior, but he also felt a deep responsibility to approach his discovery with the respect and care it deserved. The bears had trusted him with their secret, allowing him to observe their most intimate educational moments. He owed it to them to ensure that his documentation of their behavior would ultimately serve to protect and preserve both them and their remarkable cultural practices. The elderly librarian who greeted him at the front desk had kind eyes and the patient demeanor of someone who had spent decades helping people find answers to difficult questions. When Ethan explained that he was researching the history of the forest area, particularly any stories about unusual animal behavior or interactions between wildlife and humans, Her expression grew thoughtful and intrigued. "That's an interesting question," she said, leading him toward a section of the library dedicated to local history. "There are quite a few stories about that forest, some going back several generations. Are you looking for anything specific, or just general information about the area?" Ethan hesitated, unsure how much to reveal about what he had witnessed. "I'm particularly interested in any stories about bears, especially any accounts of unusual or intelligent behavior. I'm also curious about any medical facilities or training programs that might have operated in or near the forest at some point." The librarian's eyes lit up with recognition. "Oh, you might be interested in the stories about old Doc Morrison. He had a place up in those woods, must have been 40 or 50 years ago now. People used to say he had a way with animals that was almost magical. Let me see if I can find some of the old newspaper clippings about him." As she disappeared into the stacks, Ethan felt a surge of excitement mixed with anticipation. The mention of a doctor who had lived in the forest and had a special connection with animals seemed too coincidental to ignore. Perhaps he was finally going to find the missing piece of the puzzle, the human connection that might explain how bears had learned sophisticated medical procedures and developed such elaborate training protocols. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the library windows, casting long shadows across the reading tables where Ethan would soon be poring over historical documents that might hold the key to understanding one of the most remarkable wildlife behaviors ever documented. But even as he waited for the librarian to return with her materials, his thoughts kept drifting back to the clearing in the forest, where weathered mannequins waited patiently for their next lesson, and where a mother bear continued the ancient work of passing wisdom to the next generation. The ritual of the berries had revealed new depths to the bear's capabilities, but Ethan suspected it was still only a glimpse of the full scope of their knowledge and cultural practices. Tomorrow, he would return to the forest again, camera ready, notebook in hand, prepared to document whatever new wonders the bears might choose to share with their unlikely human observer. The librarian returned with a weathered manila folder stuffed with yellowed newspaper clippings, faded photographs, and handwritten notes. Her fingers traced the edges of the documents with the reverence of someone who understood the weight of preserved history. "Dr. Samuel Morrison," she said softly, settling into the chair across from Ethan. "He was quite a character, from what the old-timers used to say. Came here in the late 1960s, bought that old cabin deep in the forest where nobody else wanted to live. People thought he was running away from something, maybe a malpractice suit or a broken heart, but it turned out he was running towards something instead." Ethan opened the folder carefully, his heart racing as he saw the first photograph. It showed a tall, thin man with kind eyes and graying hair, wearing a simple flannel shirt and holding what appeared to be a small, injured fox in his arms. The caption beneath read, "Doctor. Morrison tends to another forest patient at his remote clinic." The date stamp showed 1973, and Ethan could see in the background what looked like the edge of a clearing surrounded by familiar-looking trees. "The thing about Doc Morrison," the librarian continued, settling back in her chair with the comfortable air of someone about to share a well-worn but beloved story, "was that he didn't just treat people. Word got around pretty quickly that he'd take care of any injured animal that was brought to him. And after a while, people stopped being surprised when they'd see him walking through town with a raccoon on his shoulder or a deer following behind him like a pet. But the really unusual stories started coming out after he'd been here a few years." Ethan turned the page and found a newspaper article from 1975 with the headline, "Local Doctors' Unusual Teaching Methods Draw Attention." The article described how Dr. Morrison had begun using medical training mannequins in his forest practice, not just for his own skill maintenance, but apparently to demonstrate treatment techniques to the wild animals he cared for. The reporter had clearly been skeptical, describing the doctor's claims that animals could learn and remember medical procedures as charming but scientifically questionable. People thought he was getting a little eccentric in his old age, the librarian explained, noticing Ethan's intense focus on the article. But then, strange things started happening. Hikers would find injured animals that had clearly received some kind of first aid treatment, but there was no sign of human intervention. Wounds that had been cleaned and bandaged with natural materials, broken bones that had been splinted with twigs and secured with grass, even what looked like organized efforts to move injured animals to safer locations. The next photograph in the folder made Ethan's breath catch in his throat. It showed Dr. Morrison in his forest clearing, surrounded by several medical training mannequins positioned exactly as Ethan had found them decades later. But what made the image extraordinary was the presence of several wild animals gathered around the doctor as he demonstrated bandaging techniques on one of the dummies. A large brown bear sat attentively nearby, while smaller animals, including what appeared to be foxes and raccoons, watched from various positions around the clearing. This picture was taken by a journalist from the regional paper in 1978, the librarian said, pointing to the photograph. The reporter had hiked out there to do a follow-up story on the eccentric forest doctor, expecting to debunk what he thought were tall tales about animals learning medicine. Instead, he found this. The article he wrote afterward caused quite a stir, but most people still didn't believe it was possible. Ethan studied the photograph intently, using a magnifying glass the librarian provided to examine the details. The bear in the image was clearly an adult female, and he could see what appeared to be two small cubs partially hidden behind her massive form. The positioning of the animals suggested they were genuinely focused on Dr. Morrison's demonstration, not just randomly present in the clearing. Most remarkably, the doctor appeared completely comfortable with his unusual students, treating them with the same patience and respect he would have shown human medical students. What happened to Dr. Morrison? Ethan asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer based on the dates of the articles and the current state of the forest clearing. He passed away in the winter of 1981, the librarian replied sadly. Heart attack, they said. He was found in his cabin by a park ranger who'd gone to check on him after a particularly bad storm. The strange thing was, when they found him, there were tracks all around his cabin from dozens of different animals. Bears, deer, foxes, even some they couldn't identify. It was like the whole forest had come to pay their respects. The final documents in the folder painted a picture of a man who had dedicated the last years of his life to something most people would have considered impossible. Dr. Morrison had apparently developed a systematic approach to teaching basic medical care to wild animals, using the training mannequins to demonstrate techniques that the animals could then apply using natural materials found in the forest. His detailed journals, excerpts of which were included in the folder, described successful cases where animals had clearly applied learned medical knowledge to help injured members of their own species or even other species entirely. After he died, people expected the unusual animal behavior to stop, the librarian continued. But it didn't. If anything, it seemed to increase. The animals he had taught apparently began teaching others. Rangers started reporting more and more cases of injured wildlife, receiving what appeared to be sophisticated medical treatment from other animals. It became something of a local legend, though most people outside the area still don't believe the stories. Ethan closed the folder and sat back in his chair, his mind racing to process the implications of what he had learned. Dr. Morrison hadn't just been an eccentric veterinarian treating wild animals. He had been a teacher, passing on medical knowledge to species that most humans believed were incapable of such learning. The bears Ethan had observed weren't displaying some inexplicable natural behavior. They were continuing an educational tradition that had been established decades earlier by a compassionate human who had seen potential in his wild students that others couldn't imagine. "There's one more thing," the librarian said, reaching into her desk drawer. "This was left here a few years ago by an old park ranger who said it belonged with the rest of Dr. Morrison's materials. I think you might find it interesting." She handed Ethan a small, leather-bound notebook, its pages filled with handwritten observations in faded blue ink. Ethan opened the notebook carefully and found himself reading Dr. Morrison's personal observations about his animal students. The entries were detailed and methodical, describing individual animals' learning progress, their ability to retain and apply medical knowledge, and their success in teaching these skills to others. One entry, dated just months before the doctor's death, made Ethan's hands tremble as he read it. "The female brown bear I've been working with for 3 years has now successfully taught basic wound care and splinting techniques to her 2 cubs. More remarkably, she has begun developing her own training methods, using berry juice to simulate wounds on the practice mannequins before demonstrating treatment procedures. This innovation was entirely her own creation, suggesting a level of abstract thinking and problem-solving ability that exceeds anything I could hope to achieve with my animal students. I believe she will continue this educational work long after I am gone, passing these skills to future generations of her species." The notebook contained dozens of similar entries, each one documenting the remarkable intelligence and learning capacity of Dr. Morrison's wild students. He had observed animals not just learning medical procedures, but adapting them to their own physical capabilities, developing new techniques based on available materials, and establishing their own protocols for teaching these skills to others. The doctor's final entries expressed his confidence that the knowledge he had shared would continue to spread through the animal community, creating a legacy of compassion and healing that would outlive his own presence in the forest. As Ethan prepared to leave the librarian made one final observation that stayed with him long after he returned to his cabin. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "Dr. Morrison always believed that intelligence and compassion weren't uniquely human traits. He thought that if we just took the time to teach and learn from other species, we'd discover that the boundaries between human and animal capabilities are much more flexible than we assume. Based on what you're researching, it sounds like he might have been right." That evening, Ethan sat in his cabin reviewing the photographs he had taken of the bears alongside the historical documents about Dr. Morrison. The connection was undeniable. The female bear he had observed was almost certainly a descendant of the bear doctor. Morrison had taught in the 1970s. The training techniques, the use of berry juice to simulate wounds, the respectful treatment of the mannequins, and the systematic approach to education all matched the doctor's descriptions of his teaching methods and his students' innovations. But what struck Ethan most profoundly was the realization that he had witnessed something far more significant than unusual animal behavior. He had observed the continuation of a cross-species educational tradition that had been maintained for over 4 decades. The bears weren't just mimicking human medical procedures. They were preserving and evolving a body of knowledge that had been entrusted to them by a human teacher who had recognized their capacity for learning and growth. The implications extended far beyond the remarkable story of Dr. Morrison and his animal students. If bears could maintain and develop complex cultural practices across multiple generations, what did that suggest about the cognitive abilities of other species? How many opportunities for interspecies cooperation and knowledge sharing had been missed because humans assumed such communication was impossible? And most importantly, what responsibilities did this knowledge create for protecting not just individual animals, but the cultural practices and accumulated wisdom of entire animal communities? As Ethan prepared for what he knew would be his final visit to the clearing, he felt the weight of these questions settling into his understanding of his role as a witness to this extraordinary phenomenon. He was no longer just documenting unusual animal behavior. He was recording the continuation of Dr. Morrison's legacy, a testament to the possibility of genuine communication and cooperation between species that most people would never have imagined possible. The next morning, Ethan made his way through the forest with a sense of completion rather than discovery. He knew now what he would find in the clearing, and more importantly, he understood the significance of what he was witnessing. The bear's training session proceeded much as he had observed before, but now every gesture carried deeper meaning. When the mother bear carefully arranged berry juice on the mannequins to simulate wounds, Ethan saw Dr. Morrison's teaching methods being preserved and refined. When she patiently corrected her cub's techniques, he witnessed the continuation of an educational tradition that bridged the supposed gap between human knowledge and animal intelligence. The most moving moment came at the end of the session when the mother bear performed her ritual of touching each mannequin with her nose. Now, Ethan understood that this wasn't just a gesture of respect for training equipment. It was a form of remembrance, a way of honoring the human teacher who had first introduced these life-saving techniques to her ancestors. The bears weren't just practicing medicine. They were maintaining a connection to Dr. Morrison's legacy, ensuring that his compassion and knowledge would continue to benefit the forest community long after his physical presence had ended. As the bear family disappeared into the forest for what Ethan knew would be the last time he observed them, he felt a profound sense of privilege and responsibility. He had been allowed to witness something that challenged fundamental assumptions about animal intelligence, interspecies communication, and the possibility of genuine cooperation between humans and wildlife. But more than that, he had seen proof that kindness and knowledge, once shared with an open heart, could transcend species boundaries and create lasting legacies that enriched entire ecosystems. When Ethan finally shared his photographs and the story of Dr. Morrison's legacy with the world, he did so with careful attention to protecting the bears and their sacred clearing. He worked with wildlife conservation organizations to ensure that the area would be preserved and protected from human interference, while also supporting research into animal intelligence and interspecies communication. The story became a powerful argument for protecting not just individual animals, but the complex cultural practices and accumulated wisdom that animal communities had developed over generations. The bears continued their training sessions in their hidden clearing, passing Dr. Morrison's medical knowledge from mother to cubs, generation after generation. Sometimes, hikers would report finding injured animals that had received sophisticated first aid treatment, their wounds cleaned and bandaged with natural materials, applied with obvious skill and knowledge. Park rangers learned to recognize the signs of the bears' medical interventions and began working to protect and support their healing work rather than interfering with it. Years later, when Ethan looked back on his time documenting the bears' extraordinary behavior, he realized that the most important lesson hadn't been about animal intelligence or unusual wildlife behavior. It had been about the power of compassion to create connections that transcended every boundary humans thought existed between species. Dr. Morrison's willingness to see potential in his wild students had created a legacy that continued to heal and teach long after his death, proving that kindness, once shared, could echo through generations in ways that enriched the entire world. The clearing in the forest remained a place of learning and healing, where weathered mannequins continued to serve as patients for bear cubs learning the ancient art of caring for others. The berry juice still flowed to create realistic training scenarios, and the gentle touch of massive paws still applied natural bandages with precision that would have made their original human teacher proud. In that hidden place where few humans ever ventured, the boundary between wild and civilized, between animal instinct and learned compassion, had been permanently dissolved by the simple act of one man who believed that healing was a universal language that any creature could learn to speak. The mystery of the bears' medical training had been solved, but the wonder of what they represented continued to inspire everyone who learned their story. They were living proof that intelligence, compassion, and the desire to help others weren't uniquely human traits, but rather fundamental aspects of consciousness that could be nurtured and shared across any boundary that separated one species from another. In their patient teaching and careful learning, they carried forward not just medical knowledge, but a vision of what the world could become when different species chose to see each other as partners rather than strangers in the grand adventure of life on Earth.